So you all know that tonight's public lecture will be given by Daniel Dennett, who's standing over there. He's our Santa Fe resident Darwin lookalike. And he is, of course, university professor and Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy and co-director for the Center of Cognitive Studies at Tufts, and the 2010 Santa Fe Institute Miller Scholar. We're very pleased to have him with us. Dan received his BA from Harvard in 1963 and his DPhil from Oxford in 1965 under the supervision of Gilbert Ryle, who many of you probably know. He's published widely in the philosophical literature and is probably best known for his more popular books, and there are many of them, including Brainstorms, an edited book with Doug Hofstadter, The Mind's Eye, The Intentional Stance, Consciousness Explained, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Freedom Evolves, and most recently, and I guess the subject of tonight's talk, Breaking the Spell. Bertrand Russell, himself a philosopher of note, wrote that the point of philosophy is to start with something so simple as to seem not worth stating, and to end with something so paradoxical that no one will believe. And it's for that reason that many scientists are suspicious of philosophers. But Dan is an exception. And it was interesting, I was trying to work out why. And I think one of the reasons is that Dan is a philosopher who takes very seriously empirical reality. He tries to combine advances in science with speculation in philosophy. So rather than ask about consciousness blissfully unaware of how the brain works, he will do the hard work of learning about neuroscience, about computation. And he believes, I guess, that new discoveries in science provide new materials for new philosophy. Now, in his book, Consciousness Explained, Dan said something that was quite controversial. He said that there are elements of consciousness that might be illusory. So it's a widespread experience in our own species, and yet he was suggesting to us that perhaps there are illusory components to consciousness. And I think in a similar way, in his most recent book, he talks about another widespread regularity, that is the almost universal appearance of some kind of belief in a transcendent superbeing or being. And if you subject that to some kind of objective inquiry, that might also turn out to be, in part, illusory. So in this way, I think in Dan's philosophy, he has a very consistent philosophical approach to phenomena. So he says, are objects, ideas, and beliefs that we think of as legitimate subjects of analysis really some form of epiphenomena, or what we might call at the Santa Fe Institute emergent phenomena, that are best understood in terms of the repeated action of simple mechanical rules. So if you go through his books, the evolution of complex organization through repeated bouts of simple natural selection, complex computations of the kind that we rely on every day, realized through iterated procedures, subtle states of mind arising out of the collective behavior of very simple nerve cells, and religion arising through some kind of repeated transmission of basic kinds of ideas, where the idea, I think in his case, is a belief in belief, a meta-belief, you might say. So I think, unlike many recent writers, contra religion, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who I think have slightly different motivation, I think you could claim that Dan is doing what Dan does. And that is, as I said before, subjecting natural phenomena, minds, organisms, and cultures, to careful tests of a widespread conceptual bias, and that is to explain complex phenomena in terms of complex processes. So in that sense, religion is the ultimate example, because it tries to explain complex beliefs in terms of an infinitely complex God. Okay? So in that sense, Dan is the quintessential Santa Fe Institute mind who seeks to explain complex phenomena in terms of simple phenomena. Now, some like to say that non-belief or atheism, when widely held or defended, is just another form of religion. And in fact, one of my friends said that to me tonight, and I'm rather partial to a wit who responded to this by writing that calling atheism a religion is like calling baldness a hair color. So you're not really comparing like with like. And now these are fundamentally important debates. They're important to all of us. And I think it's very important that we don't fall back on trivial comparisons and misleading arguments. And I think it's wonderful to have someone as thoughtful as Dan to help steer us through these difficult territories. Dan.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Bill Miller, for the Miller Fellowship. Santa Fe Institute is heaven for intellectuals. It is just a wonderful place to be. I'm very honored to be there, and particularly honored to speak at this occasion. So David's introduction is very accurate as far as what I'm going to talk about today. I am going to be talking about religion as a natural phenomenon. As it says on the book cover, religion as a natural phenomenon. And the question is, why study religion as a natural phenomenon? And one answer, of course, is, well, because it is one. But that doesn't put the right emphasis on the question. The right emphasis, or at least for me right now, is why study religion as a natural phenomenon? Shouldn't we just tiptoe away and leave it alone and not subject it to the sort of embarrassing, probing, awkward analysis that a scientific, naturalistic investigation of religion calls for? And I think many people, that's, by the way, the meaning of the title. The spell I want to break is the spell against studying religion as a natural phenomenon. I think we must break that spell and study religion as a natural phenomenon for a very simple reason. It's so important. All the problems that we face in the 21st century, if we don't understand the religious dimension of them, if we don't understand how people's allegiance to their religion affects the way they think about the other problems, we're going to make a mistake. We're going to make lots of mistakes. And if there's one thing that we learned from the 20th century, it is that good intentions are not enough. Let me just remind you, there were lots of good people who in the 20th century thought that apartheid was a good idea. Well, shame on them. They should have known better. Well, shame on us. We should have known better if we don't study religion carefully and understand its mainspring and its wellspring and what it's doing before we start mucking about trying to change the world. So all I'm calling for is that we subject religion to the same sort of probing, intensive analysis, objective, naturalistic analysis, that we subject global warming to, and the economy, and the water problem, and all the other phenomena that are problematic in this century. Well, one way to study anything is to get a little distance from it. Various authors have said that the point of science, or the point of poetry, you can find quotes both ways, is to make the familiar strange. To get some distance from them so that things you take for granted are no longer so obvious. So let's imagine that we're Martian scientists and we come to Earth, and what are we going to see? Well, this is one thing we're going to see. Now, what is it? Is it a whale? Is it a tongue? Is it a microorganism? No. This is a shot from outer space of approximately 20 or 30 million people gathered on the banks of a river in India. The largest congregation of human beings in history so far as we know. Now that's impressive. This is impressive too, not quite as numerous, and so is this. Here we have remarkable gatherings of bipeds, of mammals, more impressive in some ways than the Serengeti. And the Martian would want to know, what on earth is this? What is going on? How did all this originate? What is it for? How does it perpetuate itself? It can't be just an accident, just a coincidence. Nothing that is that costly in terms of time and energy, nothing that is that stupendous and just in terms of bringing together organisms in one place without eating each other. This is a remarkable thing, and we need to see what's going on, and we should try to get some distance on it. There have been lots of religions. Nobody knows how many, but if you guessed 1 million, you probably wouldn't be wrong. Hundreds of thousands anyway. Most of them are extinct, just the way most species are extinct. Most of the species that have ever lived on this planet are extinct. Most of the religions that have ever been formed on this planet have gone extinct long ago, most of them probably leaving no trace. That's why we can't count them. The ones that have survived are extremely well designed. They are robust. They are efficient. They are extremely good at persisting. How? Why? Well, compare them with languages. Successful languages are well designed too. And here again, we have a problem of extinction. Languages are going extinct, I think, at the rate of about one a month or maybe even one a week. There are thousands of languages now, but in 100 years there are only going to be hundreds or maybe dozens. These are topics well worth interesting research. Well, nobody designed languages. Well, yes, Esperanto and computer languages are designed. But aside from them, languages, although they are well designed, were designed by nobody. Nobody has the patent on French, for instance. How about religions? Well, they evolved too. They weren't invented. Again, one can think of exceptions. Scientology. And a more or less intelligently designed religion. Well, if they evolved, why did they evolve? Well, here we get the usual litany, and I'm just going to remind you of it so that we can set it aside. Why does religion exist? Well, because it promotes social cohesion and altruism, because it allays the fear of death, because it explains the inexplicable, because it secured the domination of the powerful. Those are 4 of the most popular explanations for why religions exist and persist. Well, maybe, but maybe not. I want you to set those aside. I suspect there is a grain of truth in all of them, but only a grain, because I want you to reconsider the question and reconsider other answers that you probably haven't contemplated. In particular, don't assume that religions were good for something. I have an antidote to this assumption. When I started working on religion and the evolution of religion, lots of people came up to me and they said, "Oh, Dan, that's interesting. You're going to work on the evolution of religion. That's great. What do you think religion is for?" After all, every human group that's ever been studied has some sort of religion. What do you think it's for? I said, well, I think that's the wrong question. Every human group that's ever been studied has the common cold. What's it for? It's for itself. It's for itself. It survives and we can't get rid of it. Just because something persists doesn't mean it's good for something except itself. You need to maintain an open mind about this because there are other options. Now, the idea that people were expressing and asking me what I thought religion was for is what we might call naive adaptationism. And people love to jump up and down and criticize naive adaptationism. That's the view that Pangloss's view that everything in God's green earth is for something, and it's for the good of it's for the good of people typically, and we have to set that aside. That's a bad assumption. But so, what's not naive adaptationism? What is its mark? I submit that it's this: that adaptationism acknowledges that there is design to be explained. I've already done that. I said, look, religions are well designed. They are not haphazard collections of junk. They're not random. Something has to explain that. Something has to account for the R&D, the research and development that made religions as good as they are at what they're good at. That's what an adaptationist supposes, is that whenever you find design, this improbable departure from randomness, you have a task to explain how it got that way and why. But there are more answers than at first appear obvious. So I'm saying religions weren't invented, they evolved, and now the question is how? How did they evolve? And from what did they evolve? From what? These are good questions. So here's the outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about evolutionary processes first, and I'm going to look at actually 3 different sorts of evolutionary processes: genetic evolution, cultural evolution, and, well, something that we'll discuss briefly. And I'm going to use the evolution of language as a sort of a benchmark to look at this issue, because it includes both genetic and cultural components. Then I'm going to talk about the particular cultural evolution of religion. And as my title suggests, I'm going to look at what it evolved from, which are what I'm calling the wild ancestors of religion. Then I'm going to try to defend this by showing you some of the fossil traces of wild or folk religions in domesticated or organized religions. And then I'm going to look at the end at some of the implications of this. So that's the outline of the talk. So here is a nice new diagram by Leonard Eisenberg. I love this, the prettiest tree of life I think I've ever seen. This shows all the organisms that have ever lived on the planet. And if you want to read it, time starts at the center and moves out, so that if you look around around the periphery here, I have a laser pointer here. Let's see if it works. Yes. So this is today, and we see the bacteria and the archaea and the eukaryotes, and all of these are eukaryotes. This huge blossoming, all the life that's visible. And we have the sponges and the corals and the worms, and way, way over here we have the mammals. And maybe that branch right there is where we split off from the chimpanzees about 6 or 7 million years ago. So everything that's ever lived is on here, and there's the famous eukaryotic revolution, and there's the Cambrian explosion, and so forth. So that's a phylogenetic tree. It shows the relation by descent of all the living things on the planet, all in one big tree. That's Darwin's legacy. But in addition to phylogenetic trees, there are also glossogenetic trees. That's the trees of languages, and they actually predate phylogenetic trees. There were scholars working on the evolution of languages, or in effect, the history of language, before they were working on the phylogenetic trees. Now, here's from Nature is a recent drawing of the tree of languages, and it's just showing you the Indo-European branches of the language tree. It's amusing that such a distinguished journal would have a big mistake. I'm going to show you where it is right there. The artist has put in the word Islamic, where it should be Slavic. Ain't no Islamic branch on the Indo-European tree of languages. That's just a typographical error. And you see how this tree is just really a branch on the larger tree of languages. And it's interesting that languages can, quite successfully, and this has been known for a long, long time, be put on these trees of descent with modification. I just went to the web and got a bunch of pictures of language trees. Here's the Finno-Ugric languages, the languages of China, the Proto-Mayan languages. It's just amazing how scholars have been able to reconstruct these trees of descent. And this, of course, is all cultural evolution, not genetic evolution. Genes have nothing to do with this. Now, it's hard to do these trees of languages because of a problem that we might call horizontal word transfer. Just think of English. There are lots of words of French and Spanish and even Eskimo in English that arrived into English and became part of English from some other language. This is anastomosis or reticulation. This is where words travel rather freely between languages. And this makes it hard to draw those trees. And in fact, at some point, you sort of give up and say, it's better to track individual words. We can track their histories and their trajectories through time better than whole languages. The boundaries between languages get murky and confused, but words we can usually figure out where they came from. And so we can trace words going way, way back. Now, many of you know Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, in which he introduces the concept of memes. Memes are the cultural items that are analogous to genes or to viruses. They are units that get replicated and differentially replicate, and that's where we get evolution. That's Dawkins' theory. It's deeply controversial. Many people hate it. I don't. I love it. But I am a critic of the ideas. But mainly I encounter dozens of second-rate and third-rate and fourth-rate arguments against memes. And I'm not going to spend any time on it now. I just wanted to let you know I think memes are good. I think it's not the only good idea on cultural evolution, but it is a good idea because it allows us to see how cultural evolution is itself can be, under some circumstances, a variety of natural selection. Not genetic natural selection, mimetic natural selection. Now, one of the problems I run into all is, I don't even know if there are memes. Are there any memes? Really? Have you ever seen a meme? I've seen a gene, or I know what a gene is. I don't know if there's any memes. Well, words are memes that can be pronounced. There's other memes that can't be pronounced, but if you want to know what a meme is, or what a word is, it's a meme that can be pronounced. So if you think, now some people don't believe in words. How many of you think that words exist? You believe in memes. Because words are memes that can be pronounced. Think about it. What are words made of? Sound? Ink? Words are actually quite abstract little packets. They're little recipes for behavior of a certain sort. They're actually more like Java applets. They're more like software than like things that you can weigh or that have a chemical composition. What words are memes, plain and simple. Now, one of the principles of evolution, well analyzed by generations of evolutionary biologists, is that for evolution to occur, copying must be high fidelity, but not perfect. If it's perfect, you don't get any mutation. Then you can't really keep adding innovation to your mix. Now, I want to show you that words meet this high fidelity requirement by giving you an example. What do you see? Everybody call it out. The cat. But now look, the H and the A are exactly the same shape. Exactly. You automatically, mindlessly, without intending to, you corrected the H and the A. You fixed them automatically in your perception so you could see, but only because you're an English speaker. Somebody who didn't know English at all would see those two as the same letter, but not you, because you've corrected. That, by the way, is very, very comparable to what genes, to how gene replication is done. And there are error-correcting enzymes, proofreading enzymes in your DNA that accomplish this in the same way that you just accomplished that. Now, this, of course, is an example of writing, and writing is really very different from speaking. So I want to just show you that the same principle of digitization, because that's what it is, it's correction to a norm, also occurs in spoken language. So I'm going to give you a little example. We're going to do a little experiment. Are you ready? Listen carefully. I want you to repeat after me the words that I say next. Ready? Mundify the epigastrium. Again? Again? Great, you're perfect. Do you know what it means? No, you don't have to. You don't have to. All right, now here's example 2. Are you ready? Listen carefully. Repeat after me. All right, now do it a second time. You can't do it. I spoke just as loud, there was just as big an acoustic signal going in your ear, but you couldn't do that correction that you did with the cat. You couldn't correct to the norms. You didn't have a finite alphabet of phonemes that automatically analyzed the signal coming in your ear so that you could take it in. Now, remember, with mundify the epigastrium, you don't have to know what it means. You just have to know, you simply have to have a deeply embedded habit that corrects to the norm, and that's what gives you high-fidelity replication on your computer and in your DNA and in language transmission. It is this digitization feature of language, I submit, that explains why language is the key to cultural evolution, because it's only when you have language with that property that you can really get cumulative, ramifying, recursively ramifying innovation that doesn't get washed out. Chimpanzees have a little bit of culture, a little bit of cultural transmission, termite fishing with sticks and breaking nuts and a few, signals of sexual interest and so forth. But mostly when one chimpanzee sees another chimpanzee do something, it's just they don't have the norms they don't have the alphabets for digitization. Norms of correction are the key to cultural evolution. And I want to give you a lovely quote by a philosopher, actually a French philosopher named Alain, from 1908. He's talking not about genes, but about canoes, Polynesian canoes. Well, wait a minute, I forgot a slide. I'm going to talk about kayaks first. Information about kayaks is stored in Inuit brains and also in kayaks. If you got a kayak in front of you, you got a lot of information about kayaks, but only on the assumption that the design is good. That's correction to a norm. If it's a lousy kayak, you don't have much information about kayaks. But the main thing is, and this is a theme I'm going to revert to again and again, you don't have to understand it. You just have to be able to copy it. It's correction to a norm. Here's the French philosopher. Every boat is copied from another boat. It is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others. No judgment, no intention. It's just, we make the boats that come back. That's natural selection at work. But has nothing to do with genes. This is natural selection of cultural information, not genetic information. Now, a thing about cultural evolution that makes it difficult is that it has variable comprehension. Just gave you the example of the canoe where as the comprehension can be, as it were, close to zero. If you're a slavish copier, this is the boat that my grandfather made, I'm just going to copy it exactly. You don't have to understand why this is a good boat. You don't. You just know that it is a good boat. If you copy it, you'll have another good boat. Some people may understand. They may really deeply appreciate the principles, but it is not necessary. Comprehension is not a requirement for this kind of cultural evolution. For some kinds of cultural evolution, no doubt it is. That's why variable comprehension is sort of the rule. But we want to remember that a lot of cultural evolution occurs not only without comprehension, but even because of incomprehension. Slavish copying with incomprehension is in fact a very potent principle in cultural evolution. You all know what typos are. They're typographical errors. A term I'm trying to spread that I got from some hacker friends of mine from software is thinkos. What's a thinko? It's like a typo, only one level up. It's a semantic typo. It's, I think you made a thinko here with your code. It's not that you typed the wrong thing. It's that you meant to type that parenthesis, but you just weren't supposed to put a parenthesis there. There's right ways and wrong ways of doing this. Wherever you have norms of good practice, in effect, whenever you have ways of doing it that are right as opposed to ways of doing it that are wrong, this gives rise to the possibility of correction to norms, typos and thinkos, and we can have, in effect, semantic alphabets. So that, for instance, if you've ever thrown a wheel, if you've ever taken some pottery classes, you know how to do pottery, then you see things when you watch a potter make a pot that a neophyte would not see, because you have a sort of alphabet of moves that you've learned. Oh, he's doing one of those. You may not have names for them, but you know what doing it right would be. And it's wherever we have these semantic alphabets that we can have robust cultural evolution, transmission without comprehension. We get transmission with comprehension too. That's what makes it complicated. So now, before I go on, I want to just briefly compare two views of cultural evolution. In the blandest sense, everybody believes in cultural evolution because it just means change in culture over time as a result of one process or another. Cultures have certainly changed. The culture of Santa Fe today is not the culture of Santa Fe 50 years ago, and it certainly isn't the culture of ancient Athens or of Greece or of Renaissance Florence. Those are all different cultures. So of course there's been cultural evolution. The question is, what science describes the patterns in that evolution? What explains what things happen? Now, the traditional view of cultural evolution, what you get pretty much in history books and in most anthropology and so forth, is that cultures are composed of good things. These are treasures. You might call it the cultural treasure model. And these are things that are husbanded and protected and passed on to your descendants. The Darwinian view of culture says, no, culture consists of some things that are good, some things that are bad, some things that are not good. It is not just restricted to the treasures of culture. The traditional view says, we have these wonderful ingeniuses, the inventors with insight. Cultural innovation is all by insight. Darwinian says, well, sometimes there's insight, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's sheer dumb luck. It's accidents that are the innovations that start things off. The traditional view is cultural things are valued. We preserve our culture because it's so valuable. We pass it on. The Darwinian says, sometimes, yes. Sometimes, no. Some cultural entities get passed on in spite of the fact that they're positively disvalued. We just can't wipe them out. Both say that things are passed on. The traditional view says, and we make improvements. It's a very progressive view. The Darwinian view says, well, we make mutations. Most of them are bad. They get punished the very next generation. You don't make that canoe again. Every now and then you get a good one. So the traditional view is basically an economic model. It says, culture, this is our treasury. This is our good stuff. This is what we pass on. That's part of it, but it's only a proper part. It is a sort of limiting case of a wider view of cultural evolution, which is what I'm proposing. Very important when you look at religion to look at the broad Darwinian view of culture, because not everything in religion that is passed on is a treasure. Well, now, I mentioned there might be some other evolutionary patterns in addition to genetic patterns and a cultural transmission of memes, what might they be? Well, this is an idea I've recently been thinking a lot about. Not so much differential replication as differential persistence. Some cultural entities survive, they're robust, they resist dissolution. They don't so much replicate as hang on. And they hang on as a result of processes that interact with them. And I'm just going to give you one example so you can see what I mean. Sometimes conflict enhances robustness. In fact, some religions are particularly good at provoking conflict, which then creates dichotomous reactions, a polarization, and you're either with us or you're against us. And this is a great way of getting your religion the oomph it needs to get on for another generation or two. That's not so much replication as differential persistence. We would like to know in the 21st century, when might we kill with kindness? When might we encourage the extinction of a bad feature of some religion, for instance, not by attacking it, but by tolerating it to death? I think you all recognize this is a very dangerous question. It can backfire. We want to know the facts. We want to know when it makes sense to try to tolerate something to death and when it makes sense to go after it more aggressively and not worry about whether or not that might, well, we should worry in any case, but have a good sense that it isn't going to backfire on us and make the thing that we wish disappeared all the stronger. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about evolutionary processes. Now I'm going to talk, finally, about cultural evolution of religion, and I'm going to talk about its evolution from wild ancestors. Now here's a very lovely cow, not to me a sacred cow, to some, I know, but it's clearly what it is a milk cow. You can tell by the amazing udder, and it's a very, very fine milk cow, and the question is, who designed this milk cow? And the answer is a lot of people. This is a triumph of, in effect, genetic engineering, although this was done without looking at the DNA so much as by just selective breeding. And we know what a milk cow is for. It's for us. It's for making milk. Well, what's an aurochs? Well, that's the wild ancestor of all cows. What are aurochses for? For making more aurochses. Same as every other wild species. That's all they're for. They're not for us. They're not for anything but themselves and their progeny. And it, of course, the aurochs was designed by natural selection. And many of the most wonderful and brilliant and robust features of the cow were also features of the aurochs and have simply been built upon by the domesticators who have worked to reverse engineer the cow, figure out all of its parts, and figure out how to maximize, optimize the relationship between them so that we get the most out of them. This is a domesticated animal. It is a milk-making machine for us. Now, I give you that preamble because I want to say the same thing about religion. That religions, the religions we have today, the ones that we know of with names that we all know about, these are domesticated religions. They're for us. They are the descendants of wild precursors. They are to their wild precursors as the cow is to the aurochs. As I said at the outset, religions are brilliantly designed products with an evolutionary history, and what we want to do is reverse engineer them, see how they got that way and why. Now, one thing is obvious. I mentioned language before. Language had to evolve before religion. I'm not going to belabor that point. I think it's pretty obvious that the particular features that mark a religion require language to transmit. And I'm going to look at three phases in the history of religious memes. The synanthropic phase, the domesticated phase, and the mimetically engineered phase. So, what does synanthropic mean? Well, here are some synanthropic species from the Greek with human beings. These are species we see, I'm sure these are not exotic species at all. We have the rat, the house mouse, the squirrel, the pigeon, the crow, and the barn swallow. There are plenty others. Here's another synanthropic species. It's a bedbug. These are species that are not domesticated, they're wild, but they have evolved by natural selection, and only by natural selection, to thrive in human company. They are designed by natural selection to do well in our company. They do not hide from us. They are comfortable with our approach up to a certain point. They are synanthropic species. Now what I want to suggest is that there's also synanthropic memes. They start off wild, and then they gradually, some of them, become domesticated. Now words are, I think, synanthropic memes. What does this mean? It means they're not domesticated. It means that in spite of the Académie Française, French takes care of itself. It doesn't belong to anybody. Nobody is its steward or boss, although there are plenty of self-styled protectors of French. It carries on largely oblivious of them. It doesn't need them. Languages and words in general do not need that kind of attention. Now, remember one of my themes is that words as memes, they have their own fitness. And they don't always have to be good for us. Well, so I'm telling my students one day recently, I said, words, don't make the naive assumption that words are always good for us, that words are always tools, that they always have excellent uses. Some words maybe have no good use at all, but simply survive because they can. They're sort of like verbal bedbugs. And the student said, "Can you give me an example?" And I said, well, it's as if there was a word like you keep putting it into your conversation, and you wouldn't even realize it you were doing it. And he said, I got the point, I want an example. Superstitions, rumors. What these have is the feature of any synanthropic species. They have to fend for themselves. They don't have official protectors. They have to fend for their own replication in competition. How do they get started? Well, now, here we have to now revert to genetic evolution for a moment and describe an instinct, a genetically passed on feature, disposition that we all have, and that we share with other mammals. Now, we had a lot of snow here in Santa Fe this winter, and I'm used to snow in the east where we have slanted roofs, and a very common thing, which I don't think many of you experience around here, is a whole lot of snow sliding off your roof with a big thud, landing outside the window. But you may, in the east, you're sitting there by the fire with your dog, and thud, this great snowbank falls off, and your dog jumps up and looking around to see not what made that, but who made that. The dog goes into an orientation reflex and is sort of looking around for the agent, friend or foe, that made that. That reflex we share with the dog. The difference is that the dog, not having language, after it looks around a little bit, it goes back to sleep. It doesn't find any problem. But not so human beings, because we have language. Now, this is called the Hyperactive Agent Detection Device by Justin Barrett. It's what I call the intentional stance on a hair trigger. It's the same idea. Now, in order to understand how this might work, we have to understand a feature about evolution I think a lot of people don't, and that is that evolution is the amplification of what almost never happens. Again and again, you have things that almost never happen, but evolution depends on them. Mutation almost never happens, but the evolution depends on it. Speciation almost never happens, but evolution depends on it. And here's something else that doesn't happen a lot, but it could, and it could be the start. So I'm going to give you a little sketch of a sketch. So here we go. So there you are, back in your hunter-gatherer days, and you're out in the woods, and it's getting dark, and you're with a companion, and you're far from home, and you hear a noise, and you look around, and you think, oh my God, that I could have sworn that tree just spoke to me. And your companion says, what, a talking tree? And you say, no, of course not a talking tree, but just for a moment there, I thought there was a talking tree. He says, a talking tree, you believe in a talking tree. You say, no, well, I don't really believe in a talking tree. It's just that for a moment there, I could have sworn that I heard a talking tree. And pretty soon, you're back in home, you're back in the village. Guess what? He believes in a talking tree. Well, I'm not sure I do. But pretty soon, everybody's talking about the talking tree. You don't have to believe in it. It's just an idea that's going to catch on a little bit, and it's going to spread. How many times did I say talking tree in the last minute? Each one of those is a replication of that meme. Pretty soon, you have dozens and dozens of descendants of that original oops moment. Now, let's suppose this happens 99 times out of 100, 999 times out of 1,000, it just dies. That's the way evolution works. One time, it catches on. There's something about that idea that is unforgettable, and pretty soon, that talking tree is added to the population of invisible, goblin-y type things that your village believes in. And there's also the fairies and the goblins and all kinds of imps, fairies, gods, leprechauns. Every human community that you ever look at has got a bunch of them. They've got a little population of these. And I suppose I've just given you a rough idea of how they get started. And the ones that are unforgettable, the ones that stick in people's heads, are the ones, of course, that replicate. They're competing for rehearsal space and brains. What are the winners for? They're for themselves. They're cognitive bedbugs. They're like the common cold. They don't do any good at all. They simply have found a niche that they can exploit. And some of them replicate like rabbits. What they're for is occupying the minds they find themselves in. Those are the synanthropic memes that are the ancestors of the gods of religion. Well, now, how clever it was of sheep to acquire shepherds. Look what they did. They could outsource their protection from predators, their food finding, their health maintenance, small cost, loss of free mating. And, well, how clever was it? Well, there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of sheep in the world today. They're their closest wild relatives you could carry off in an ark or two. It's been a huge fitness advantage for them to go domesticated. But of course, it wasn't the sheep's cleverness. Sheep are stupid. In fact, all domesticated animals are stupid compared to their wild relatives for the simple reason, use it or lose it. They've outsourced all their problems. They don't need those fancy brains, so they don't have them. That's true. Francis Crick once talked about what he called Orgel's second rule, that evolution is cleverer than you are. The sheep aren't clever, but this is a very clever arrangement for the sheep. They are the beneficiaries. They are the unwitting, uncomprehending beneficiaries of a very good arrangement for them. Same thing happens with religion. The wild memes of religion, which had to fend for themselves, they had to be vivid and unforgettable. They had to compete for rehearsal room. They got themselves domesticated. They acquired stewards. And that changed everything. They acquired stewards who were prepared to devote their lives to their flourishing. So, when did this happen? Well, we have ritual burials that seem to be religious in a way 20,000 years old. That's not very long. Agriculture began about 10,000 years ago. Domestication of memes is roughly contemporaneous, I would guess, with agriculture. But first of all, let me say something. I am not an expert on the evolution of religion. Nobody is. I want to change that. I want there to be experts on the evolution of religion. What I'm doing is sketching out a theory which is probably false, but which gives you something to fix. Because it's high time we develop these ideas carefully. In comparison, Judaism, which is the oldest by far of the Abrahamic faith, is about 3,000 years old. So we've had a lot of domesticated religion before then. When we became conscious stewards of our ideas, this changed everything. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about cultural evolution of religion from wild ancestors. Now I'm going to talk about a few fossil traces of that process. Rituals. Unforgettable events, thanks to music, to hallucinogens, to terrifying spectacles. This, I think, is all a direct descent from the wild ancestors, which, remember, weren't for anything. And it's not that people thought, hey, wouldn't it be good if we had some rituals and used some hallucinogens? No, they didn't have to think of it that way at all. It's just that the ones that happened to be associated with rituals and hallucinogens did very well, and the rest went extinct. Unison chanting. You find this everywhere. And there's a very lovely, deep explanation of the role it plays. If you have a group of people with imperfect memories, and every now and then you get together and you chant in unison the creed or whatever it is, nobody has to remember it all. As long as people forget different parts of it, they correct each other, majority rules, and you get highly reliable transmission out of unreliable parts. Von Neumann was famous for inventing... The reliability of your computer depends on the same idea. It was invented by natural selection, natural cultural selection, a lot earlier. We have to remember that these early religions were pre-literate. Information transmission was a major hurdle, and so a lot of the features of early religions are features that are they're design features, not bugs, but features. They're designed to make reliable transmission possible, but nobody designed them. Nobody figured out nobody had to. Now we're going to talk about the transition to domestication. The word Islam means submission in Arabic, or surrender to the self-interest to the will of Allah. This isn't just Islam, of course, because Christianity has the same thing. The heart of worship is surrender. Surrendered people obey God's word even if it doesn't make sense. Well, now, who said that? Pastor Rick. If you're interested in a reverse engineering of his book, you'll find it on TED.com. I did that a few years ago at TED. Rick was not amused. Here's a parchment that I got in a Paris bookstall about 50 years ago. It dates from about 1540. What it is it's a Gregorian chant that says, Semen est verbum Dei sator autem Christus. The seed is the word of God, and the sower of the seed is Christ. This is a theme that runs all through Christianity. The idea of planting those seeds and harvesting the results and being a steward of these domesticated ideas and spreading them. It's a very deep and central part of domesticated religions. And very briefly, we know what cows are for. They're for us. Well, what are domesticated God memes for? They're for many things. A few of my favorites. Julian Jaynes writes brilliantly, I think, in an otherwise sometimes cranky book about religious gods as decision aids. When you face a decision and you just can't decide, it's much more impressive than flipping a coin, for interesting reasons. the anthropologist McLennan suggests that they're props in the bedside manner of shamans or shamans. They are placebo effect props, very valuable. And this could actually provide something that a lot of people are looking for. You notice I have hardly mentioned genes, but some people are looking for what they call the God gene. I think that's a mistake to even think about that way. But there could be a God gene, or there could be a gene for susceptibility to ritual. Why? Because back before there was medicine, modern medicine, there was shamanic healing. And shamanic healing actually works to a certain degree on certain things. It's particularly good for preparing women for childbirth, a dangerous and painful business. Well, if you have a tin ear for ritual, if you just are not moved by ritual, then the placebo effect probably won't kick in. You don't have any health insurance. There was a time when there could have been very strong selection for susceptibility to the sorts of rituals that shamans culturally discovered and invented and passed on. In the same way that we now know there's been genetic selection for lactose tolerance in adults in those people who are descended from dairy herding lineages of people. Here's where you have cultural transmission of dairy herding, that ain't in the genes, creating a genetic effect. And there could be a genetic effect arising out of shamanic rituals too. Everybody knows this idea, surrogate police. Religions, gods are very good for this. Big Brother is watching you. Now I want to talk about a few adaptations of organized religion that you do not see in the folk religions that preceded them. This was very apparent at the tsunami and after Haiti. Don't blame God, but we thank God. We thank God for the good stuff, but we never blame Him for the bad stuff. Primitive religions or folk religions, they blame their gods all the time. This is a recent development of organized, domesticated religion. Don't ever argue with the devil. He's better at arguing than you are, having had thousands of years to practice. This is a very cute idea. This is Rick Warren again. He didn't invent it. This is hundreds and hundreds of years old. But what it is you notice it's a sort of wild card for disarming any reasonable criticism. Somebody comes up to you and says, well, tell me about your religious ideas. I want to just understand them. They're very affable, very reasonable, very calm, but also probing. Do not talk to that person. That's the devil. I think the most important one is that belief in God is a requirement of morality. This is not a feature of folk religions, but it is certainly a feature of domesticated religions. A cute idea, good without God becomes zero. Clever little meme. I'm sorry I'm passing it on to you, actually. But it nicely illustrates the fact that memes spread whether they're good or whether they're true or false. All they have to be is clever and memorable, and they may spread very well, even if they're not true. So much then for fossil traces. I get finally to the implications. Remember Dumbo and the magic feather? There he is up in the tree, and he's scared stiff, and the crows come up with this brilliant idea of just taking a crow feather, tail feather, telling him, this is your magic feather, now you can fly. It's a lovely story. It's a really charming story. What if religion is Dumbo's magic feather? Now, Dumbo needed that magic feather to find the courage and conviction to be all that he could be. And maybe we need it too, or maybe some of us do. Maybe what religion is today is a sort of a morality prosthesis that helps a lot of people be better than they otherwise could. I'm deadly serious. I think this is probably the best idea about what religion is good at. But I want you to remember that Dumbo threw away his crutch. He didn't need it in the end. And now the question is, do we still need religion? Maybe what religion is a nurse crop. When I have a farm in Maine. When I reseeded my hay fields many years ago, my old neighbor said, well, Dan, you want to plant oats as a nurse crop along with the timothy, the hay. And I said, what's a nurse crop? He said, well, it comes up first and it protects the hay, protects the timothy till it can get a good start. You can then harvest the nurse crop as oat hay, or you can harvest the oats, and and you don't have to plant it again, and you give the timothy a good start. He says, that's a nurse crop. Well, that's a nice concept, and I've thought ever since, well, maybe religion is a nurse crop for civilization, for instance, for science and for secular institutions. Maybe we needed religion in the early days of civilization to get enough security, enough stability, enough confidence in society to get things going. But now maybe we don't need it anymore. It's a question worth exploring. The question is religion good for humanity today? Which is entirely distinct from whether it was a necessary condition for getting us to where we are now, which it may well be. Now, most people think that it is. Most people, I'm sure, think that religion is good for humanity. And this creates a problem. Because there's no good reason, I think you'll all agree, to believe in Zeus. There's no good reason to believe in Thor. There's no good reason to believe in Poseidon. There's no good reason to believe in Zoroaster. There's no good reason to believe in Jehovah. There's no good reason to believe in Allah. But there are good reasons to say that you do. Mainly to protect the magic feather. And this creates an interesting problem. Is there any harm in keeping the magic feather myth alive as an official lie? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is yes. Yes. I'm going to give you 3 reasons, or maybe many more. And I'm not saying that these 3 reasons rule that they outweigh the value of keeping the magic feather alive. I'm just saying this is the problem. This is what we have to try to assess. First, there's the problem of protective coloration. And I know this really bothers many people who are deeply religious. And that is that benign religion provides protection to toxic movements. If the mafia had just, as it were, started a religion along the side and built some hospitals and orphanages, it would be much easier to go after them, and much harder to go after them than it is. When you think about things like Jonestown, or this young man much more recently, Kambach, the blasphemer sentenced to death for blasphemy. Sentenced to death. His sentence has been commuted. 20 years in prison, it may be further commuted. This just within the last few years. Astonishing. That's in Afghanistan. Not the Taliban's Afghanistan. This is post-Taliban Afghanistan. Then there's the problem of systematic hypocrisy. Could an atheist be elected to high office? Well, we have Pete Stark in the House of Representatives. I'm often asked, well, could an atheist ever be elected president? And what I say is, we've had lots of atheist presidents. They just wouldn't admit it. An Episcopal priest once said to me, in private, when I found out what my Mormon relatives meant by God, I rather wished they didn't believe in God. I've been pursuing this for a number of years, and just actually today, we published our result. Linda Lascola is a clinical psychologist and in-depth interpreter and questionnaire administrator. And working with her, we found 6 originally, and then 5, 1 dropped out, 5 closeted, non-believing preachers. These are 5 different Protestant denominations. They do not believe in the creeds of the churches that they are ahead of. And they are stuck in a terrible trap. and their cases are all different. And if you want to read about it, you can find it on the On Faith website run by Newsweek and the Washington Post. Our essay. There's already more than a dozen commentaries, and I was saddened and amused, not surprised, to see that the first dozen commentaries by, including some rather famous spiritual leaders and theologians, they commented without reading the essay. I think they're afraid to read the essay. But anyway, I commend that to you as food for thought. These are moving cases. These are good people who are trapped. My third reason is that it encourages irrationality. I had a debate in London with, I can't remember his name now. He's a Lord somebody. Well, he defends religion. And the debate was, is religion the greatest threat to a rational scientific worldview? And I took the question seriously. I said, well, if it isn't, what is? Maybe alcohol? Or drugs? Or maybe violent video games? I ran out. I couldn't think of anything else that might be a greater threat. And the reason I think that religion is the greatest of the threats is that it doesn't just disable, it honors the disability. But we can take steps to minimize these three defects. If we look at religion through the lens of evolution, if we try to reverse engineer it, we can figure out what the benefits are, what the weaknesses are, and we can begin thinking about how to encourage religion to become something that we're all much more comfortable with. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
So thanks very much for a very stimulating lecture, Dan. So I think we're going to take about 15 minutes of questions, and then we're going to leave, and it's going to be difficult to get out. So I guess some people are leaving already. There's a question right here.
That's a very good question.
You might repeat the question.
Yeah.
For the...
If we set about reverse engineering religion, how are we going to decide what's good and what's bad? Indeed. Well, let's think about reverse engineering other things. If we reverse engineer a car or a computer or a way of extracting fossil fuels, we have lots of missions, and there's a sort of political discussion that has to happen where we decide how great are the costs and how great are the benefits. And I think the same thing is true of religions. I think we have to look at them. First of all, if we reverse engineer religions, we are thinking of them primarily as systems of practices and ideas that are very good at sustaining themselves. Now, I don't think there's any quarrel about that. So that, for instance, if we look at, as some people do, they look at Vatican II, and they say, this was one of the most terrible mistakes that the Catholic Church ever made, because they actually reformed away some of the very features that made Roman Catholicism as strong as it was. This was an engineering mistake. Now, we can evaluate the evidence for that independently of whether we want the Roman Catholic Church to do well or whether we want it to go extinct. This is an engineering question. Was that, from the point of view of the question of strengthening and prolonging the institution of the Roman Catholic Church, was that a bad idea or a good idea? That's an engineering question. Yes, sir.
So, there are different aspects that one could judge this process of reverse engineering. One would be the economic impact of a religion that one designs. Another might be the social or the psychological effects of the religion, and those effects might vary, for instance, for rock stars as opposed to scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any comments on that?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think we need to understand that religions they operate on many levels. They have many different requirements. There's many different kinds of people that they have to deal with, to say something just neutral. Because some people they are employing, some people they're helping, some people they are protecting, some people they're ignoring, and it's a very complicated thing. And I think you're exactly right that nobody thinks that we want to have a sort of standard vanilla person that we want to use as our. This is the person that we want to engineer our religion to deal with. And in fact, one of the great strengths of religion is that there are a lot of people in this world that nobody loves, that are lonely, that have no particular talents, and they need something. They need a lot. And if religion can provide that, that's great. And we should bear in mind all the good that does. But we have to balance that against everything else that the religion does. Yes, sir.
If we are going to, or if desirable to reverse engineer religion, is that a process that's analogous to changing the aura into the milk cow by breeding techniques?
Well, when you reverse engineer the milk cow, you're sort of, as the term says, reverse. You're working backwards to see what you came from and what you've got now and what the strengths and weaknesses are. So I think that reverse engineering religions is a matter of recognizing that some of the design features, some of the traits that religions have are very, very ancient, and probably you tamper with them at your peril, at least as far as the robustness of the religion is concerned. I think, to give a sort of obvious example, when people strip all the ritual out of a religion, it's not long for this world. Yeah.
You commented in the description here that religion may evolve faster in the next 20 years than in the past 200. Can you say a little bit what might happen?
Yeah. In the preview, I said that religion may change more in the next 20 years than it's changed in the last 200. It's certainly changed more in the last 200 than in the 2000 preceding. By almost any measure I can imagine, we had a fairly long period of relative stasis, and then all sorts of new developments in the last couple of centuries have led to the huge changes in religions and in their doctrines and in their practices, and of course in the competition. And religions in America, let's just talk about America, have changed tremendously just in the last 30 or 40 years with the rise of the megachurches, for instance, and the relative demise of a lot of religions which used to have a lot more influence. A lot of people think that religion is on the rise in America. No, in fact it isn't. The percentages are about the same, and in some cases they're falling, and the fastest growing group in America, by a large margin, is no religion at all. This has religious leaders very worried. The Baptists, for instance, are baptizing approximately the same number today as they were in 1950. The population of the country has more than doubled, And so you might say the Baptists are losing market share in a big way. What's going to happen in the next 20 years? What's going to be the effect of the internet and television? We've already seen the effect of televangelism and so forth. What's going to happen in the Islamic world as the internet makes a greater and greater and harder to thwart presence in the lives of people around the world? We are in a tumultuous period. Now, should we just throw up our hands and not try to discern the trends that are going to be strong and that we should try to shape? I think it's so important that we should try to figure out as much as we can about it as fast as possible.
So the question becomes, with the possibility of opposing genes or adornment genes, is it possible that it keeps waiting for a primitive environment to rise again where it can jump back out?
Oh, sure.
I'm saying, should
Yeah.
we also realize as a possibility that as our environment is changing, we may keep
Indeed. Yeah.
and that potential to jump back out at another time?
Well, you're talking about genes, and I don't really want to make it about genes because I don't think, but we're talking about parallels with genes, and I think yes, I think that what one sees, for instance, is that the resurgence of the Orthodox Church in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union is a very interesting phenomenon. It's not simple, and I don't claim to have a really good account of it, but I think that's the sort of thing you're thinking about. Yes, indeed. Yes, sir.
Where do you feel Buddhism fits in on it? It doesn't technically consider itself a religion or have a God.
Yeah. In my book, I give a definition of religions which does, in effect, leave at least a lot of Buddhism out. And yet, it does seem to be, in some ways, a religion. What do? Change the definition? I'm going to keep the definition I have, which does involve a profession of belief in a supernatural being whose approval is to be sought. Indeed, there are religions that don't have that. And I view that as, it's a little bit like the British government wisely declared that the common octopus is an honorary vertebrate. No, they did. The law in England says that you can do anything you want to an invertebrate. It doesn't count as cruelty to animals. If you want to throw a live oyster on the grill or a crab, you can do that. If you want to step on worms, knock yourself out. But don't dream of doing that to a vertebrate, because we protect vertebrates. So it's a legal line, and it's an important one, and it's a good one. And it was vertebrates. And then people said, wait a minute, how about the octopus? And they looked at the octopus, and they decided that they should give it the same protection as vertebrates because it was so clever. It had such an interesting mind. It was such a sophisticated mollusk. And so, I'm sorry to say, I used to think it was all of the cephalopods, but no, it's only Octopus vulgaris. So that's, I think the British law should be changed again. So similarly, I think that Buddhism is sort of an honorary vertebrate. Yes. Who? Oh, John Gray, the British John Gray, yes. Yeah. Well, I've only read some of them, and I haven't believed them at all. I'm not impressed. John Gray, British writer, has argued that that religion is coming back strong and that this is inevitable. And the question was, do you think that it's going to evolve? It's going to be sort of like antibiotic resistance. That we're in a losing battle with those of us who would like to have some antidotes. I think that's a classic case of wishful thinking. I don't think he has any evidence to support his view. If you look at the recent worldwide studies, religion is not on the rise. It just isn't. He's just wrong. Yes, ma'am. No, not a religion, but a very important cultural force that should be studied intensely. Yeah. Maybe as one of the successor institutions that we have to take very seriously. I mean, people say, well, some years ago I was asked by Jonathan Miller, the British polymath who did a program about atheism, and he asked me if I thought that religion should be abolished. I said, well, the thing is, I don't know what's going to replace it. And until I know what's going to replace it, I'm not for abolition. And that's still my view. That's why I want to study it, because I think we need to know more about both what good it does and what harm it does. And we don't know. I don't know and you don't know. That's why we have to study it. Yes?
The analogy to the common cold is a little confusing. We don't like the common cold. We try to get rid of it. People who practice religions, they love it. They support it.
Some of them do and some of them don't. Many of them do, absolutely right. And many people love smoking too. Yes, I take your point. Look, my analogy with the common cold was meant to bring everybody up short and get them to realize, with a bit of a shock, that they are not entitled, they should not, just as a matter of intellectual honesty, they should not assume that religions are good for us. Maybe they're good for us. Prove it. There's a lot of people who think that religions are good for us. They may be right. Let's have an even playing field and let's see what they can say. In the book I have, in Breaking the Spell, I have an example where I say, imagine that you read in the morning paper that, in the New York Times, Science magazine, that scientists prove that music is bad for you. That removes points from your IQ and raises the risk of various illnesses and so forth. You read this. If I read that, my first reaction is, well, that's tough, because I'm not going to live without music, and that's it, period. I don't even want to know. And you got to be wrong. That would be my first reaction. But then I would hope I would temper that and say, wait a minute, let me take a deep breath. I'm pretty darn sure that music is wonderful. And I want to, but if I'm wrong, if it really is damaging my children and my grandchildren, then for goodness sakes, I want to know the facts. Now, I'm sure in my bones that music is good for us. I'm not sure in my bones that religion is good for us, but it may be. But I think we ought to try to find out.
I'm going to make this the last question.
Yeah, I know, that's the problem. As I say, I'm not the expert and there aren't any experts yet. And it's even worse than that because, quite frankly, it's hard to get really good people to go into this field. Because a lot of the work that's been done in the past has not been so red hot. And it's a problem. There are the clearinghouse for good work, actually, is probably the website that David Sloan Wilson runs out of SUNY Binghamton. At least you find out what the spectrum of people working on it is pretty well. No, I'm afraid there aren't any good programs yet. Well, I don't know. I can't. It's David Sloan Wilson's website. It's at SUNY Binghamton, and if you